second with authenticity in learning. Sorry, making noise with the microphone. My name is Gail Watson. I will be the chair for the sessions. I'm fascinated by the subject, and we want it to be as interactive as possible. So we really encourage you to start popping why you're here, what made you choose this session today, why are you interested. You can be as specific as you want. It's a problem. It's probably a little vague for us to really answer the question, but that was a good try at the technology. So just checking if we're ready to start. Yep, ready? All good. So thank you, and very warm welcome for those of you who's just joining in. You can come near the front, I promise. We're a little bit out of practice of doing those things real life, but I'm going to try not to spit on anybody. Welcome. Hope you're enjoying being back with real people. There is no mute button. It's real life. It's loud. It's a bit chaotic. It's really fun. Today we're going to talk about authenticity in learning. And we all get to know when authenticity feels right, when it's really authentic. But what are the making of authenticity? So Mark, who is going to be our first speaker, is going to present a really brilliant case study, and is going to be followed by Céline, who is kind of unpicked the best practice, and we're going to look at the making of this authenticity into deeper detail. So we're going to have the questions removed, but we're going to keep them. And during the sessions, we are going to ask you at the end too, also if you want to pop your questions using this technology, feel free to do so. You can also say at the top the hashtag if you're on Twitter, if you're these kind of people. You're welcome to use the hashtag and tag and tweet about these sessions, and maybe use it as well as a way to ask questions. I will have a quick look at Twitter and look at all those fantastic points that you're making. But without further ado, I would like to welcome Mark, who is going to present with the head of learning innovations at New Cross Healthcare Solution, and who is going to present his brilliant case study that I'm sure you're going to love.
Hello, good afternoon. So just before I start, and as latecomers are coming in, I've just got to get a selfie of this. So just bear with me. Can you kind of raise your hands and look massively engaged? Thank you. Brilliant. I'll study it to see who isn't engaged later. So my name is Mark Story. Thank you very much for taking time to come and watch and listen, and I'm the head of learning innovation at a company called New Cross Healthcare. As a company, we employ about over 12,000 healthcare professionals. So these are carers, nurses, support workers, and we provide them out to the care sector on temporary assignments to cover shortages of staff. Also, as part of our business, we provide direct care to people in their homes. This isn't domiciliary care. This is looking after people with very complex or life-limiting needs. And my role, and the team's role within that, is to make sure that they're onboarded, that they're appropriately trained, and they're effective carers. And the story that I want to tell you today is about authenticity in learning. And what I mean by that is not a passive intellectual test of memory, but making sure that learning is active, making sure that it's relatable, and making sure that it's memorable. And as with all good stories, where do I put the clicker? There we go. As with all good stories, it starts with a call to adventure. So it starts with a conversation between myself and my boss about 4 years ago, reflecting on our onboarding process of our carers at the time. The challenge and the objective that we set ourselves was, what if we could create a learning experience we were so proud of that we wanted to frame it? And to give you a backdrop of the sector that we're working in, it's a very people-focused sector. So I can't think of another sector where such vulnerable people place such trust in people, where often low-paid staff, and I'm pleased to say that we're a real living wage employer, but often low-paid staff are expected to have such high levels of skill and are given such high levels of responsibility that can often mean the difference between life and death. So, to paint you a picture of what we used to do. So we would employ about 120 people a week across the UK. This is 4 years ago. And we'd invite them into one of our 63 locations across the UK, and we would sit them down in the training room, often on their own, and ask them to watch 4 hours of training DVDs. Then somebody would come in and would give them a paper quiz, and they'd have 25 multiple choice questions that they'd have to pass in order to demonstrate that they had learnt those 4 hours of training DVDs. And also in our sector, we have a practice of shadow shifts. So this is new staff going out with experienced staff and learning on the job. But the inherent nature of this is that it's inconsistent, that often you pick up bad habits, and it depends on the day as to what it is that you're going to learn. So we had an unengaging process, we had inconsistency, and we had challenges around scale. So we sought to change this approach, and we partnered with Sponge. And I use the word partner deliberately. So we used Sponge because they had a track record of being creative, of being innovative, of injecting fun into e-learning. But more than anything, we chose them because of their desire to partner with us rather than just be a supplier. And the mission that we set was, can we create something that we are both proud of sufficiently to want to frame? So what did we do? Together with Sponge, we devised and we developed a thing called the virtual shift. So this is an online, immersive series of mini stories that the learner engages in. And in it, they meet relatable characters and they come across relatable scenarios, things that our carers and our nurses would face every day. And while they're doing...
I think you've spoken for too long already, Mark. So let's introduce the stars. Beatrice, Fiona, Peter, and of course, yours truly.
Right. So I'd like to introduce you to one of the stars of our virtual shift. This is Major Bingley. So hello, Major. And I want to introduce you to Major Bingley a bit more formally. So Major Bingley is actually a real-life person. He was the first person that New Cross Healthcare ever cared for. He was ex-military, so he was a war veteran from the Korean War, and he was living with dementia. And as a result of his military bearing, he's a very proud man, and he likes to stride up and down the corridors of the New Cross care home. But as a result of him living with dementia, he's not as aware of the risks as he might normally be. So in the virtual shift, when you meet him, he has a fall. And if you're supporting somebody who has dementia, first of all, you need to get to know the person behind the dementia, the person behind the condition. But also it's a test of your ability to step into their reality, to communicate effectively with them, to help them understand what is going on around them. So in this virtual shift, when he has a fall, you have to manage that situation and navigate that situation, bearing in mind the importance of communication and the challenges represented by Major Bingley's dementia. And if you navigate this successfully, then you receive a letter from Major Bingley's doctor saying, as a result of your appropriate and swift action, Major Bingley has made a full recovery. So, Major, would you like to introduce the next character?
Yes, thank you, Mark. That got a bit personal. Let's move on to introduce the lovely Fiona, shall we? Meet Fiona. She's a single mum with a teenage daughter, Izzy, and baby son, Benjamin. She's a strong lady who likes her independence, but she needs help to look after her family. Fiona cherishes the time she spends with Izzy and Benjamin. Building memories for their future is really important to her.
Thank you, Major. So Fiona has got late-stage multiple sclerosis. And she's at the end of her life. And your mission as her carer is to support her to spend her remaining time with her young family. Now, in the virtual shift, Fiona dies. I knew I wasn't going to get through this. Fiona dies, and she dies at home, holding the hand of her teenage daughter, while her teenage daughter is reading the contents from a memory box. And that's you as the learner that has created that situation. I'll just take a moment. And death is an unfortunate reality of our sector. But through the virtual shift, we're able to provide people with an authentic emotional experience of it. And I think that emotional, authentic experience in a safe place is something that's really valuable to people when they're preparing themselves for work. So, Major, before I really start crying, can you introduce our next character?
Another fellow resident in the care home is my good friend Peter. He's a gentle old chap, likes to keep to himself, usually with his head buried in his collection of train magazines. He takes great pride in his beard, which always looks immaculate. Peter is a family man and very close to his wife and daughter. They spend a great deal of time reminiscing about his younger years spent on the railway.
Thank you, Major. So Peter is also end of life, and he lives in a care home. And your mission, looking after Peter, is about how you communicate with him. And how you communicate the subject of death, and how you communicate that with Peter himself, who's dying, and with his family, enables you to demonstrate empathy, of course, but also demonstrate respect. It enables you to show your expertise and competence, which will reassure them of your ability to manage this situation. But I do want to assure you that not everybody dies in the virtual shift. And while there's a serious subject matter often, there's a dozen or so characters, we've managed to have a lot of fun putting this together. So Kessia here, for example, your mission with her is to take her out on an enablement trip, to take her down to the pub for lunch. And the pub is called the Pritchard Arms, and that's named after David Pritchard, who is our long-standing company secretary and accountant. And if you just look in the back there, just the green draft cider, it's called Hamilton Cider. And that's a nod to Mandy Hamilton, who's our head of complex care, which is the division that you'd be working in if you were supporting Kessia. The medal that Major Bingley is sporting is a real medal that he would have got awarded in the Korean War, suggesting that no level of detail is too small for us to pay attention to. And there's Grace, the carer. So Grace is in our team. And Boris the dog is the actual, that's not the actual dog, but Boris is an actual dog who belongs to Juliet, our head of clinical governance. Simon here, who is the guide to our support work virtual shift, is our clinical training manager. And Nurse Michelle, who is the guide to the care home virtual shifts and the nurse virtual shifts, is our co-founder and MD and still retains her nurse pin badge. And Bashir, who you meet, he's actually wearing a Torquay United football top from 1996, which is when and where New Cross were first created. So while we had fun, it has to be built on solid foundations. And these are the takeaways that I want to offer. So first of all, mapping out the standards, the sector-specific regulatory outcomes that we have to hit, the learning outcomes that underpin these programs, has got to be a first step. What is it that we need the learner to come away with? But then I would encourage you to go through the often challenging, lengthy process of co-creation. So involving our healthcare staff to understand and listen to their stories about their experiences, to share with them the characters that we were proposing, and to make sure that both the stories, the scenarios, and the characters were believable, relatable, and authentic. And using characters and narrative-led scenarios enabled us to engage the learner in some sort of progression. They wanted to see it to the end. And when we developed these stories, and I shared with you Fiona, and Fiona is a made-up character, and there's me kind of choking up when I tell you the story of her, it allows us to achieve real emotional engagement. So I hope you've enjoyed meeting some of our cast of characters from our virtual shifts. But I'm sure you're wondering, so what? You know, it's great to spend your money and your time putting people in Torquay United football shirts and so on. What has the impact been? So there's a number of impacts. First of all, in terms of engagement, so a virtual shift has now been completed 45,000 times since its launch in September 2018. And each one of those completions represents somebody that didn't have to sit down in a training room on their own for 4 hours watching the old kind of 1990s training DVDs. So that is a win in itself. But because we've been able to teach people, instruct people, and assess people's ability to make clinical and behavioural decisions, we've recognised that complaints since the launch of the virtual shifts has come down by 10%. It was low anyway, just to reassure you, but it's come down again. And in terms of the impact on learners and the experience of learners, so we asked for feedback, and I would ask you, are there any learning programs that you have where you get the word love in the feedback? Or fun? Often there's fun, but love, it stands out to me as a particularly powerful word in this scenario. And we have nagware and nudges, like you all do, where we prompt people to do all of these things in a timely manner. But what we do is we send those from the characters. So we maintain that, we maintain ourselves in character. So the nagware comes, for example, from Major Bingley saying, "Hi, Benjamin, look, I'm struggling, I need you to come and help me." And what we find often is that our learners will respond to the character and explain either why they haven't done it, when they're going to do it, and then perhaps some words of advice to the character as to what they can do in the meantime. That, to me, it's not a metric, but that to me suggests that people are really connecting with this. So in terms of the future, I think we're building a universe of characters here. Each one has got a fully fleshed out backstory. Each one has got a defined set of complex clinical needs. And we're already starting to use those characters in other training courses. So we've developed a virtual meds round to help train people to deliver medication within care homes. And we're just developing a care certificate course as well, in which we're hoping to use these characters too. But my vision of the future is thinking about the metaverse and thinking about the day in which you might be able to walk down the corridor with Major Bingley, you might be able to walk through the doors of the New Cross Care Home, or you might be able to actually sit in the cafe or the pub with Bashir or Kessia. So at the beginning of this presentation, I explained to you what our challenge was, our call to adventure, and it was What if we could create something that we're so proud of that we'd want to frame it? There we go. We did. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think we can definitely feel authenticity when we see it. There were quite a few wet eyes, isn't it, when in the audience? But now I would like us to maybe think a little bit deeper about what lays under the beautiful package of this authentic story and this learning process, and maybe look at what we can see in terms of processes and method that will help us to transfer this knowledge into other type of environment. And with us, we've got Céline, Dr. Céline Moulin, who is going to share with us her expertise. Céline, are you ready?
Yeah. I don't know. Thank you, Gail. I don't know how to follow that. I was bawling my eyes out crying during that. Thank you, Mark, for sharing that story. I'll probably cry again. I don't know why I bothered topping up the mascara before I came in here. So hopefully we'll have some slides up here in a moment. Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to ask you all, authenticity in learning. So just even having seen Mark's presentation there, and for you, what is authenticity in learning? Do you want to shout out what it is for you? Realness and emotion. Super, thank you. Anyone else?
Connection.
Connection, thank you.
Making it as real as possible.
Making it as real as possible. Okay, I'm going to take all of those, absolutely. Authenticity in learning is all about making it applicable to the real world, whether that's the content, the context, or the task. And it's also about the relevance to the individual, the learner. And so, hopefully this will work. I love this, just making learning meaningful by engaging the learner in relevant and real-world learning. So it sounds simple, relevant and real-world. However, for all of us working in learning, we know that it isn't simple. So what I want to do as we move through this is to get us thinking really deeply about relevance, so that hopefully when you walk away from this session, you may have some knowledge and some information and some ideas that you can go away and implement quite simply around this relevance and real-worldness. So the only reality which matters to us is the one in which we are or will soon be actively engaged. Of course, when it comes to learning, I'm only going to be interested in where I am right now with regard to whatever role it is, and or where I'm moving towards. And so, as I say, I want to get you thinking about, if somebody is trying to learn something, we've got to make it relevant. Otherwise, we're not going to disrupt old neural pathways, and we're not going to create new neural pathways. So I want to get us thinking a little bit how we can create relevance and create new neural pathways. I'm also going to share a few case studies of some work that we have done in partnership with some of our clients around authenticity in learning. And as I say, I want to give you some thoughts on how you can create authentic learning. Just to say, I was asked to join this stream by Don, I think because of my background. I'm a psychologist and coach. I've been working in learning and development, partnering with a range of organizations and sectors for the last 15 years. Prior to that, I was a psychologist, and I just moved into learning kind of by mistake. And I'm sure some of you have also moved into learning by mistake, because I always meet people in learning who we didn't go to school and come out of school going, I'm going to move into learning. A lot of it just kind of evolves. And I've written 2 books, Our Learning Brain and Developing Learning Habits. And my focus with these books is always to help us think about the psychology of learning with a little bit of a sprinkle of neuroscience, neurobiology, and making it really practical so that we can apply this in how we are designing our learning, whether that's face-to-face or whether that's e-learning or video, whatever it is. So the place where I always start, which I find helpful, is that we've got to remind ourselves that over 40% of our behaviors and our decisions are habitual, automatic, and unconscious. When you're working with and designing for learners, you've got to remember that all of those individuals, those people, have 20, 30, 40 years plus of habits that are embedded, that are well in place. And so as people working in learning, we've got to create stickiness. And how we can do this is through looking at this topic of relevance and real-worldness and authenticity in learning. So just along with relevance, I just wanted to give us a quick list of the various different ingredients that are required in order to make learning sticky and to actually create change, because this is what I have committed myself to over the years. And so both from my experience and also looking at the research that's available, I just want to remind us of a list of ingredients that help us to create stickiness and create real change, behavioral change. So relevance, as I say, clarity, creating clarity, introducing novelty. Novelty is one of the most impactful ways to create change, and we've seen this already with Mark's story. Of course, Mark's story with Home Cross and Sponge really brings to life relevance, and I know I don't need to say that. Curiosity, relationships, so much change happens within a relationship. And even the examples that Mark has shared, these are characters, there's relationship that's developed. As Mark said, there's a backstory that's created, and so the change is happening in relationship. Within those relationships, of course, we get feedback from others. Sometimes in the organizations that I work with, they're not great, and I'm sure you find it's not easy to give people feedback on their learning and actually just recognize the learning and the change that they're making. However, the brain also needs feedback on the changes it's making and that it's going in the right direction in order to create new neural pathways which embed the change. A few more things to think about: focus and attention. So even here today, you know, there's so many things that you could pay attention to. You could pay attention to Gail, you could pay attention to the screen, you could be reading London UK 2022. And it's very hard for me to make sure that I get your focus so that you pay attention to the things that I want you to pay attention to in order to create the long-term memories that are required for you to behave a different way. However, you know, so this is one of the things that we need to constantly think about because our brains are being attracted by all sorts of information. And if anyone was at Julie Dirkson's talk earlier, she gave us lots to think about on that. Of course, practice repetition. If we are not creating opportunities for some sort of either novelty or repetition, it's very unlikely that it's going to stick in order to create the change. Mistakes. Allowing people to make mistakes is really, really important and part of the learning process. And in a lot of organizations we work with, mistakes are not necessarily welcome. Another thing I have really found is conscious awareness of our obstacles. So, of course, there's all sorts of other obstacles coming at us, outside of us, and there's lots of internal obstacles. So the stories we tell ourselves, our own self-identity, these things can get in the way of us making the change. And I'll come back to that as we go through this piece. Humor and play, if we can bring that on board, not always possible. And also there's a huge amount of research now showing that embodiment and movement can really create change. Because a lot of us get stuck in the thinking. A lot of us get stuck in the conceptual, cognitive thinking of learning. And ideally, we need to bring people into their bodies more in order to help them change. And rest and sleep is a really important part of creating behavioral change and getting learning to stick. And we can't really have an impact on whether our learners rest or sleep. We have no influence on that, sadly. However, there are some things that we can think about. And so Julie earlier talked about intrinsic motivation, and if you were at her talk, she talked about a scale from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. If we can really create relevance for somebody and create novelty and make it more applicable to their real world, their real role, the role they're in or where they're moving towards, then we are going to create more self-regulated motivation. It's going to come from inside rather than it's expected to come from outside of us. And so it's really important, just to say, I'm going to throw in a few little things here from neuroscience in case they're of interest. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I just think it's really helpful to think about some of the concepts from that area. So some of you may have heard of the reticular activating system. This is an area in the brain which actually, it's kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? It has an impact on what we actually pay attention to. So for example, it's a filter, that's the word I'm looking for. About 2 years ago, just about 3 weeks before the first lockdown, I went to buy a new car. And I have no idea about cars, but I went to the Toyota sales room. I was thinking about getting an electric car. And then when I walked in, I saw this CHR hybrid, which I'd never seen before. I decided to buy that. I fell in love with it. I know it's really sad. I've never fallen in love with a car before. I loved it. I bought it. And then literally after that, all I saw on the roads were CHR hybrid Toyota, right? Everywhere. Suddenly, my reticular activating system, now it's noticing these things in the environment because it's something that's important to me now, whereas I'd never seen them before. And this is what's really important with regard to focus and relevance. We're only going to pay attention to things that seem useful to us. And again, I don't need to say it, but I think Mark and team did this really, really well, where they actually brought focus to certain things by actually gathering the stories, talking to staff, talking to the people who are using the various different services and gathering those stories and made it really, really relevant. And also they created novelty through the different characters. And Mark was telling me that they have run the training with people who are new to the organization, and you have to go through a virtual shift to unlock an opportunity to move into that particular area of the service. And also they run it with existing staff, and they can go through these trainings on an annual basis. And either way, there's a huge amount of novelty, even getting the emails from somebody saying, I've had a fall, from Major Bingley, etc. And novelty is so important because, again, just a little bit of the neuroscience, the hippocampus is where long-term memories are stored. And if we want to create long-term memories, we've got to do something that is going to communicate with the hippocampus. Rats, for example, it's been found that if you damage the hippocampus of a rat, and you move something in their cage, they won't notice it. Whereas the rats who have an intact hippocampus will notice that the change has been made. Humans as well, if you just put humans in a scanner and say things like, the man spread butter on his shoe, there will be a certain type of electrical activity that happens in the hippocampus, which shows a reaction to this novel piece of information. So if we want to create those neural connections, we've got to make things relevant and or novel. And again, just two neurotransmitters that are really interesting to think about is when we come across something that is novel and or something that seems relevant but a little bit challenging, that's where the neurotransmitter norepinephrine actually starts to increase. Norepinephrine, or adrenaline as we would call it, is something, of course, that happens when there's something that happens that's unexpected, that sends us into fight or flight. This fight or flight, something that's unexpected, is really useful for learning because it increases that norepinephrine, which then also impacts on dopamine, because now the brain is expecting something and it's looking at, well, am I going to be rewarded for this or not? And so the dopamine is increasing. And these are the types of things we need to think about when we're creating learning. Creating that authentic learning is going to help us to interrupt something and then help the brain start looking at whether this is going to be rewarding for me or not. And again, don't need to say, but Home Cross have done this really, really well, where they have interrupted somebody's thinking and then help them to go, as Mark shared, those stories, which are really emotionally engaging. The person is really, the learner is really paying attention. Their brain is paying attention to where is this going to go to, what's going to happen. And so I just wanted to put it to you, is there any other ways that you have come across that you think we can create novelty? Shout a few things out.
Drama, surprises.
Drama, surprises. I thought you said drums, but absolutely, Nigel, thank you. Anything else? Fear, absolutely. I always think things like role play, things like that, put the fear of something in us. However, most people will say after that a lot of learning has come out of that. So it's fear, it's really engaging and gets us thinking. Anything else?
Discomfort.
Discomfort, absolutely. So actually, can I ask you all to do something that might make you feel uncomfortable? Would you mind standing up for a sec? If you can. If you can't stand up, just to move your position in your chair. And can you just take a deep breath, inhale, and bring your arms up. And then exhale. Close your eyes. Inhale again. Think about something you would like to do differently because you've come to the conference so far. And as you keep that in mind, exhale. Turn around and look at the person behind you. Is there someone behind you? Just say hello. And now come back to me. So you might remember, you can sit down now, you might remember nothing else from this talk, but you will remember just having to stand up, do a little few breaths, and look at somebody else and say hello. So, point and question. And the thing is that novelty is not as, what I'm trying to say is novelty is not as complicated as you think. It literally can be something as simple as getting somebody to stand up. So even if it is e-learning, asking somebody to change their position. What I said earlier about embodiment and movement, we're seeing that anything you can do to get people into their body is going to help embed the learning. So creating emotional relevance, and also the why. If any of you are coaches or have studied coaching, you'll know how important why is. So helping people to align to their values and or what is the purpose of me doing this. Even getting people to think about, well, what is, if I don't do this, if I don't actually apply myself to this, what's going to happen with my career or my role in 2 years' time? So using the why is creating relevance. And again, this doesn't need to be complicated. Like just asking people, well, what's important to you? You know, where are you now? Where do you want to get to? And what do you need to do in between? And why do you want to do that? Sometimes, even with e-learning, we can ask those questions. And in my experience, I'm not seeing a lot of these simple questions being asked that help people to align with their why. The final piece that I just wanted to talk about with regard to just getting us to think about how the brain works with all of this is if we can create intense concentration on something, we are much more likely to embed the change long term, okay? And it's very hard to create that intense concentration. I want to tell you why you need to do this. Obviously, Mark did it and colleagues did it with their characters, their stories, and those characters' needs. That creates intense concentration, and also because by unlocking that virtual shift, you can then, it opens up other opportunities for you throughout the organization. And I mentioned sleep and rest earlier. So just to say that when we do something different, okay, so even have a different experience, there is an area again of the brain called the nucleus basalis, and when we do something different, this releases acetylcholine at the neurons that have been involved with doing something different. And then at nighttime, when we're sleeping, that's when it goes to work with regard to the neuroplasticity. Okay? So it's not even in the moment of learning, it's potentially 10, 15 hours later when the person is asleep or resting. So whatever we can do to create some sort of little change is going to embed something well beyond that at nighttime. And as I said earlier, we can't influence whether our learners get sleep and rest. We can definitely encourage it. And so as I say, that acetylcholine gets released. So as I said, much of our behavior is habitual, conscious, unconscious, and automatic, and we need to be disrupting it as much as possible. I don't think I need to say that again. So, you know, I just wanted to take you very briefly through a few case studies where we have really focused on authenticity in learning. We have done it through VR in training. We use a lot of forum theatre and role play where we go and we gather the stories from around the organization and we bring it to life in different ways. So whether that's face-to-face, whether that's through VR, whether through video. And I also just wanted to tell you briefly about a 10-week program that what the exit interviews have told us about what makes the difference to people actually creating change. So just very briefly, first of all, we worked with FBD Insurance in Ireland between 2018 and 19, and we created a number of VR experiences for them. And they were interested in doing this because they had to replace somebody who they'd lost, who was one of the, sitting with Nellie. So it was one of these people who was somebody who staff would sit, new staff and or people who weren't performing well would sit beside and they would shadow, and this person would mentor them. And this person left the organization. And they didn't really have the budget to replace that person. So they wanted to create something that would help replace what that person did and also make it scalable and also create consistency. Because as Mark said earlier, sometimes if you are having people shadow others, it depends who they're shadowing. And also FBD were interested in using VR because it has 27% higher emotional engagement, 34% longer than 2D video, and there's 33% more knowledge retention than 2D video. And also the retention rate of information, according to some research, is 75% compared to 10% for reading and 5% for lectures. You'll get these slides afterwards, so don't worry. And so just to take you through, we created embody the expert concept, where we actually, again, we gathered the stories from around the staff members. We took real scripts from customer scripts that had been used, phone calls that had been, between a customer service agent and a contact center agent. And then we actually mounted the camera on and around this is a real staff member's head, so that when the user puts on the headset, they're actually immersed into the person from the contact center's body. And so then they are in the real office there, which is relevant to them, and they're experiencing something that's helping them to understand what it is to be in that role. And this was both for newcomers to the organization and also people who were low performers in the contact center, and also to educate people around the organization with regard to what these people do in their role. And I wanted to share this. So embodied simulations seem to slip beneath the cognitive threshold affecting the associative unconscious parts of the mind. It's directly experiential. So anything we can do to immerse, and I think that's probably the next level for you, Mark, is to immerse, as you said, with metaverse, etc. This is just an example of when the person puts on the VR headset, they're now immersed straight into the office. And they see what the customer contact center agent sees, including the board with targets. And one of the things that we've noticed is that it builds confidence. So research with staff using this has found that it builds confidence because it's relevant, it's novel, and they're immersed in it. And also that there seems to be an aspect of creating false memories because of how this works. And so some of the comments from learners include, when I made my first real call, I felt like I had done it before. It makes you feel like you've done a call and achieved the sale, and it trains you in the exact environment that you're working in rather than a meeting or training room. There was a few examples of where people actually went into their first contact center practice calls and said, and their calls were brilliant, and they were asked, how'd you do that? And they said, well, because I've done it before. They hadn't done it before, they had just been immersed in this experience 3 times, a 15-minute call 3 times. So we got Winners of the Excellence in Digital Learning Award 2019, and what the judges said was that it was sustainable, and we moved past the novelty factor of VR. Just 2 other examples I just want to share with you. DALA, this is a virtual reality training for teenagers with anxiety. I know this is adult learning we're talking about, however, a lot of adults are experiencing an anxiety, and I just wanted to share this example with you very quickly because this is something that, again, we worked with the real users, the teenagers, to create the stories.
I wasn't ready the second he was.
And
Huge row. He's so annoying.
you can just hear the Dala, the teenager's
So
voice.
busy and loud here this morning.
And there's different
my head's going to
characters who
explode.
are appearing. And
Oh no.
this is his
Do I have my
teacher,
English
our
homework?
teacher. And again,
If I
so
don't, there's
we
no way this friend
created
will believe I did
all
it.
these
So just
stories
love
and
the
these
usual
examples
lecture about
working with the teenagers, having conversations, running focus groups, so that they actually created all the scripting, the stories, etc. for us. And then now it's been rolled out across the organisation, across the child and adolescent mental health services in the west of Ireland, and having a huge impact. So again, you'll get the slides after this. Final thing I just wanted to share with you is the Skills for Growth program, which is a 10-week program which happens virtually for 90 minutes, once every week for 10 weeks. And I just wanted to share this with you because with our exit interviews at the end of the program, these are the types of things that people are saying it's life-changing for them. What they're saying makes the difference to them creating their change is this self-discovery and awareness, the rewriting their identity, the mind-body connection, and the impact of community. And so if we come back to the simplicity of creating that focus, that relevance and novelty, it doesn't have to be complicated. Asking people just to even think about who am I in my role and who do I want to be? That's helping them to think about their self-identity, helping them to think about their own self-awareness, their values, what's important to them. That's novel. That's getting people to think and focus about what's relevant for them. What we have concluded is that, and this is an ongoing piece of research alongside this program, is that helping people to understand how they can create change. So some of the things that I've shared with you around how we actually create change helps people to create change. On the slides, there's a few free PDFs you can download. So just to remind us, so we've hopefully given you a few things to think about how you can create this focus, to create these neural pathways, to create this relevance. Some case studies about authenticity. I have lots more case studies I could share with you. Happy to chat afterwards. And hopefully you have some ideas about how you can create relevance, real-worldness, and authentic learning. So thank you so much. Sorry if I went over, Gail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark and Celine. Yes, please. We're going to have now a Q&A sessions, and maybe we can bring back the first book club to see if we have addressed some of your points. And before we get started, I would like to give us a chance to maybe have a quick look, but also I would like to ask maybe Mark first, because we're here to know how you made it work. And I think a lot of our participants are very interested in knowing a little bit more about what was your process, your best practice process, Mark, to reach this first, the first pilot, the first story, the first virtual shift that you created?
So, am I on? Can you hear me? Yeah. So the process, I had to convince the board, first of all, to take a leap into this. So they gave me a bit of seed money to do a kind of proof of concept, and we worked with Sponge on that to produce a little gaming scenario with a character. It was Doris originally, Doris's Delightful Day, where you had to run Doris a bath and you had to make sure the bath was the right temperature. And it grabbed their imagination. So then they gave me a budget of about 120,000. Am I okay to say actual numbers, Adam, Olivia? Yeah. So about 120,000, and our first virtual shift was created with that, and it took about 9 months from yes, let's go to launch. Subsequent ones have been slightly cheaper because we've got a lot of the assets already.
And so how do you manage to, so did it started with you or did it started with your partners? So how did you talk to your member of staff? How did you, what was the process in place to really create those characters, create this authenticity, this reality, this relevance?
So we started with the learning outcomes. We had all the learning outcomes mapped out on Post-it notes, and the Sponge team came up to London to meet our owners, Stephen and Michelle, and we started talking about characters that they had come across in running the business. We came across, or we identified Major Bingley as a character. Identified a character called Beatrice, who was Michelle's auntie, still is Michelle's auntie, and Joan, who's Stephen's mum. So we started kind of playing with these characters just in broad terms, what they might look like. Then we went out to our healthcare staff and we spent sessions, and we'll remember these sessions, asking them just to take us through a shift. What does a shift look like? What kind of things do you do? Do you then go make a cup of tea? Do you sit down? Do you know, what do you do? And that helped us flesh out what the scenarios might be. Then we took those learning outcomes and said, right, we could hit those learning outcomes with that story. So it was a very iterative and collaborative process, that initial bit. And it was lovely and exciting. You're in it for the long haul. You've really got to power through that. You know, there's a lot of detail to go through at that stage.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now we're going to move on to our next book club. For those of you who prefer to type your questions, you can also raise your hand and shout, or ask me and I can bring the microphone, especially if you're at the back. So we're going to move maybe more into your questions to Mark and Celine. Anybody's got a questions with the dying to ask? Let me just give you the microphone.
I guess my question is around really kind of convincing the stakeholders about things like when you're creating stories. Obviously, in real life, people make mistakes, and Celine, you talked about the importance of making mistakes. I guess my question is, sometimes when in my own e-learning work, approach clients, and you know they're very anxious to show the right way of doing things. Is there a hurdle when it comes to convincing them that it's important to show to get learners to make mistakes and show mistakes happening as well in our stories?
Thank you, great question.
I'm just happy to quickly respond to that with regard to the immersive nature of some of what we've been doing. And what we noticed was when we started playing with all of this just back in 2018, that we noticed that because of what I said about we were creating false memories, so we were very mindful that we didn't want to create false memories where people were making mistakes.
So I want to chip in on that as well. Just recently, we were reading about some research where making mistakes is actually a more effective learning process. And being an ex-trainer and facilitator, I can certainly kind of relate to that there's nothing worse than when a team gets the exercise right, you know, because there's nothing that they pull away as learning. So when people do make mistakes, then there does seem to be a real stronger learning point. And using this kind of environment to make it a safe place to make mistakes, I think, is important. But I would support Celine's point that you don't want people's lasting memory to be that they're somehow a bit of a failure.
So you just need to think about the approach you're taking. It's definitely going to be useful in some approaches, but not others.
Thank you very much. Great question. Anybody else on the microphone? Oh, thank you very much.
So I work for an organisation where things change really quickly. So I was wondering, how adaptable are these technologies and things that you were talking about in order to respond to those changes?
That's a great question.
Great question, isn't it?
I've got two people in my team here, and I think they would support the view that we work in an environment that changes quickly as well. So we learnt from the first one. The second one that we produced, we agreed with Sponge that we would have some editing rights in there, that it needed to be editable. And we also have now taken the approach that they're much more modular. So there's smaller modules that might require change. So being able to edit is really important, and making them smaller units of learning has allowed us to keep pace with change.
And something simple we've done is just to make sure we separate with the VR, is to separate the video from the audio, record them completely separately, so that if changes are taking place, then at least we can re-record an audio, or the staff can do it themselves very easily, and we can bring the two pieces together.
I'll just give you a very quick example. So in basic life support, there was new guidance that came out this year that if you get burnt or scolded, it was the advice that you had to run the area under cold water or lukewarm water for 10 minutes, and it's changed to 20 minutes. And that was 20 minutes is a long time, right? But that was a proper pain for us on the face of it, because we had instructional videos with audio and so on. But actually, thank the team and their ability to edit things, we were able to make that change very quickly.
Coming.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. £120,000 is a lot of money for any training budget. I just wondered, what was your backup plan if you were turned down? Because it needed to be changed. What would your approach have been?
So it was a bit of a test of the board to see if it was the kind of company that would commit and back me. So there was an element of, well, if this doesn't work, then maybe I need to find somewhere, the sort of organisation that would be up for this. We had a project team, and the MD and co-founder was in that project team. So she was massively wedded to this as a concept after we'd done the proof of concept. If they'd have said no, I think that's a great question, and I haven't thought about that at all, actually. If they said no, then we would have found some other way. I think that's a strength of us as a team, that we will take what resources we've got and we'll make something out of it. It may not have been 3D graphics and animation and so on, but the storytelling doesn't need to have a budget. The budget was really about the kind of getting support with the process, the expertise in terms of putting it together in the technology, the 3D animation and the assets. I think that was the bulk of that. So if you were to strip that out and just focus on the stories, I think we could have produced something that would have been effective, better than it was, but perhaps not have the kind of emotion, the full emotional engagement that we've achieved. Does that get me off the hook?
I mean, that was the basis, because smaller businesses won't have that kind of budget. So what kind of tips would you give them to work around that? I
would say focus on kind of be creative about your storytelling, and enjoy it. Have fun with it. So we try and make learning very worthy a lot of the time. And in doing so, perhaps we miss out on a bit of the kind of the realness, you know. We're all people and they're all people. The learners are all people. So yeah, I would say storytelling doesn't need to have a budget.
Thank you very much.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
Just something that we did. If you are gathering the stories from around the organization, then there's a multitude of what you can do with those stories. Some of the stories that we gathered from staff around FBD, we were then able to use in some of the other trainings that were being delivered. So we were working with the organization around values, behaviors, and culture, and we were able to use some of the stories in that. We also were delivering management training and performance management training for managers. We were able to use the stories, some of the stories we'd pulled, and use it in that. So even if you don't have the budget, once you've pulled the stories together, you can use them in so many different ways. And then also just to say with behaviour, you can create something that's passive, that's at least novel and gives somebody 10, 15 minutes of learning for 25K at this point.
Thank you both. Great question. Also, I think it can probably show that if you get your key stakeholders and the top management on board, you can probably achieve a lot. So that was a great takeaway. There is a question there, but I would like us to maybe turn to the question board, if that's okay, just for a second. We've got quite a few questions that's coming up. And then there is one that's came up a little while ago. It said, how do you define your learning outcome from the outset? And I think that one is more for you, Céline. How did you decide that VR virtual was the right option? Yeah, I think we're a bit limited in characters. On a few occasions, we're missing the last bit. So how does it work with learning outcome? So
this might be more of a question for Céline, I think. But the work that we're doing at the moment, we've identified a whole range of different characteristics of learning outcomes and what the appropriate technology might be to deliver those. So if something is kind of knowledge-based, we just want people to be aware of something or possess some knowledge and demonstrate that knowledge back, then e-learning, low budget kind of e-learning is perfectly fine. But as you get into the more kind of experiential stuff or the need to demonstrate how to do a procedure or a practical skill or whatever, that's where we start expanding on the technologies.
Can I just follow up with a question that I think is kind of linked to what you just said? Is the training supplemented that you offered with any other resources, performance resources? How was it? Is it just you take it and that's it, or are there like extra?
So within the modules, there are resources. There's a resource section with downloadable stuff, and they may be PDFs or charts or whatever, things that might support the learning material. If you were to break our virtual shifts down into its component parts, we've got courses that, kind of more traditional courses that support each of the learning outcomes in their own right. So you could do it in a whole number of different ways, but this is the learning that we want our care staff to have and the behaviours that we want our care staff to have when they go out, which is why we kind of packaged it all up in that way.
Thank you, Mark. Céline, maybe we can just look back to the learning outcome and what makes you decide on a technology or a solution rather than another?
So what we have found is that usually when people are coming to us around these VR experiences, sometimes they're coming to us because they've heard we're doing this, and sometimes it's because they know that we'll pick from a whole basket of eggs of different ways of doing this. But what the topics that usually come our way is or the learning outcomes is usually around when they want to create confidence in skills or behaviors, when they want to create more empathy on the part of the learners. And so it's usually around confidence and empathy in skills and behaviors. And so then it's creating something that is going to fit that. And for some of the clients that we've worked with, well, not for some, for all of them, they want to create something that is going to be consistent for every single learner and that is going to be scalable across the organization. And so that has an impact on using the VR piece because it's going to be consistent for every learner and it's going to be scalable. Just to come back to the point about, you can use the Google Glass headboards now instead of the full headset, which obviously brings the price down to like a tenner per headset. And so in defining the learning outcomes, when we say with some of the pieces that we've done around confidence, it's looking at, well, what are the specific elements of confidence? Because confidence is such a broad word. What are the specific elements within confidence? What do we want people to be thinking and feeling and saying at the end of this? And that then helps us, then combined with the stories that we're gathering from staff and the examples that we're combining, then helps us to get on track with reaching those learning outcomes. Does that answer the question?
Brilliant, thank you. We've got very little time left. We've got 2 minutes. And I think we're going to pick one of the questions that's here maybe as probably our last question. How do you know the engagement with the story translate into the real world change in behavior?
So the reduction in complaints tells me that there has been a translation of that learning into the real world. And the reason it tells me that is, I mentioned that we've got a low level of complaints. I'll just say that again. But we get complaints. We do a lot of business and we get complaints. And 2/3 of those complaints, as I'm sure you will appreciate, will be about behaviour and attitude. So seeing a reduction overall in complaints suggests that there has been an improvement in behaviour and attitude, as well as an improvement in clinical decision making. And you can track that from the launch of the virtual shift. So I'm confident that it's related to the introduction in the virtual shift, and I'm confident that we've seen that increase because of the focus on clinical and behavioural, which go to make up our complaints.
Thank you, Mark. Céline, do you want to add to?
Yeah, I'll try and answer really briefly. So it's funny when you try to be brief, then that actually disrupts. With some of the pieces that we've created, so say for example with the FBD pieces, what they found was that the what's the phrase I'm looking for? Going from training to being on the floor, the transition, we use the word transition, is quicker. So people are moving from here to here quicker than they would have than previous cohorts. I mean, because there's a huge amount of turnover of staff in contact centres, in customer service contact centres. So they would find that the transition from the training to the actual being able to take the phone calls is much quicker for the new staff. Low performers, people who weren't performing well on these calls, prior to experiencing this VR immersive experience, their targets, they actually started reaching more of their targets. With the other experience I talked about with the anxiety, VR for anxiety, what we found was some reduction in anxiety symptoms in those teenagers. And there's lots of other, I mentioned skills building earlier. There's another project that we worked on where people, the ability to have conversations with the customers on certain items that they were selling in this organization increased quicker. And I could give you lots of other examples.
but we're running out of time. It was very inspirational. Thank you very much, Mark and Céline, for coming with us and sharing. In the spirit of learning, you can take part into our last word cloud and tell us what you've taken away from these sessions. And maybe take a moment as well to reflect on what you want to apply, what you want to do with it, and how you want to make authenticity part of your next learning design or learning experience. Thank you very much, and can you join me in giving a good clap to...
Thank you, Gail. Thank you.